I'm Maria Maycap, and today we will be talking about graphic memoirs. We will be exploring them through the use of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home and Are You My Mother? So, this presentation is divided into four sections: the introduction, a section on blending the genres, a section on language limitations, and finally concluding with a close look at Fun Home and Are You My Mother? So when we talk about memoir, Kusar, during the discussions throughout these few weeks, we have established that a memoir is not fiction. It's not novels. It's a depiction of real life individuals, people who are or were alive and breathing and have passed through this earth. We have established that, most importantly, the author, the narrator, and the protagonist are all the same person. And in addition, there's a commitment to things that are real, things that are not fictionalized or enlarged in terms of like spreading the truth. One of the things that Kusser mentioned was that the boundaries between genres, though not marked by bright lines, still matter in a number of ways, not the least of which are legal and ethical. One of the things that stood out to me was the contradiction that Kusser makes in saying that genre is fluid, but at the same time saying that a blend or a blurring of the genres was something that was not desired because it would impact the legal and ethical standards that the memoir holds. And so that is what my presentation will mainly focus on, because Alison Bechdel's graphic memoirs are essentially playing with the blending of the genre. There's that main focus of graphic novels versus graphic memoir, exploring how much of this is real, how much of this is not, especially with Bechdel's writing, in the sense that because there's a lot of inclusion of allusions and metaphors, there is this gray area where it's very unclear what exactly is the truth and what exactly is she kind of extending the truth on. In addition to that layering, the subtitles are pretty interesting. Fun Home is labeled a tragicomic, and Are You My Mother is labeled a comic drama. One of them is embedded in looking at the tragedy aspect of her father passing and her having to kind of cope and kind of deal and accept everything that was going on in terms of her sexuality and identity. On the other hand, Are You My Mother is more focused on the drama between mother and daughter. And drama here is used kind of like twofold, because the mom was an actress, so she did star in dramas. But at the same time, there's this implication of embellishment in order to kind of reach the truth. And of course, both have the word comic in them because that is the medium that is presented to us. But then there's also an additional layer, because these works are considered autographies. Warhol introduces the term autography and distinguishes Fun Home as both a memoir of her closeted gay father who committed suicide and an autobiography detailing her own growing up and coming out. So in a sense, Bechdel is playing with multiple genres, and so this directly ties into Kusser's argument that, this blending is a dangerous thing because, the search for truth that we see in memoirs is something that should not be tarnished or lightened in any sense of the word. So, in terms of the limitation of language, there is this comic book there's this book, this text that talks about understanding comics. And so one of the things that the explanation says is that comics offers tremendous resources to all writers and artists: faithfulness, control, a chance to be heard far and wide without fear of compromise. It offers range and versatility with all the potential imagery of film and painting, plus the intimacy of the written word. So there is a lot to unpack here. So MacLeod sums it up pretty well in his text. which is, in a nutshell, saying language is beautiful, but it has its limits. And where we can bridge those limits is through the use of comics. Of course, two of the key concepts would be the faithfulness and control aspect. So McLeod is essentially arguing that, contrary to Kuser's belief about, the memoir needing to be held on this pedestal of, the pinnacle of truth, comics are able to provide that truth, but also be very intimate in terms of the form and the content. Comparing these two texts, they are very similar in some ways, but different in others. So on the screen, you will see a couple of key points, key similarities, and key differences. So obviously Fun Home, which we read in class, is based more on and focuses more on the father and coping with that grief, that loss, that queer identity, and of course the family relationships and dynamics. Whereas Are You My Mother focuses on the mother who is alive and is able to provide her own commentary on some of the things that occurred in Fun Home, in addition to, writing. So there is that meta aspect to it. In addition to talking about themes of queer identity, motherhood, femininity, mental illness, and that complicated mother-daughter relationship dynamic. A researcher, Lowe, mentions that Fun Home became a queer classic, essentially because it's layered with social and personal histories, in addition to playing with perspective and memory. Are You My Mother addresses head-on Allison's emotional entanglements, essentially. The relationship at the end is clear, but it's clear and resolved, but at the same time, there is still this gap left between mother and daughter. So when we talk about the search for identity in these graphic memoirs, I have provided two images from the comics that Bechdel produced. On the left side, we see Fun Home, and we were all familiar with it because we read it. And so those are one of the last parting shots of the text. And so I went ahead and took a screenshot of the ending of Are You My Mother? And so for Are You My Mother, there's, of course, the text, the same layering, the same font. But there's also this difference in the sense that although both are talking about identity, there's this distinct kind of emotion that sets them apart. Part of that is gender. I mean, just by looking at both images side by side, you can tell that there is a distinct color difference between them. Is it due to gender or is it due to preference? I think it's due to gender. However, I am open for interpretation as usual. But I think the color essentially kind of shows that distinctiveness, because you can even see it in the background of the image. Like, it's all black. The only color you see is white and red. It is very darker, very more grounded in terms of questions about identity, more theoretical. Okay, so when we look at Fun Home, I have chosen two images that kind of demonstrate Fun Home as a whole and kind of like the struggles that encompass that particular memoir. Dr. Barunis writes that Bechdel implies that literary transmission is not about inheriting a tradition, but about expanding one. Not a matter of having room, but of making room. And in these two images, we see that making room aspect of it, because these are all experiences that are rooted in Bechdel's childhood and kind of like the past. However, we as the reader can identify and kind of fill in the gaps that are present even within these strips by themselves. For image one, a lot of people can identify, for example, with the gender roles. Like Allison is saying, who cares if the necklines don't match? there is a struggle with conforming to identity that is present in society, and so that pushback is something that any reader could relate to. In Image 2, we see the queer identity experience where both of them are kind of coming out to each other and kind of having that conversation. And also through Image 2, you can see how Bechdel is very careful and meticulous with the facial expressions. The dad clearly looks afraid of confronting his identity, something that Bechdel was not. Kind of see that generational gap and kind of like how people relate to queer identity or coming out is a struggle for a lot of people. Okay, when looking at Are You My Mother, I chose two specific images in order to kind of give you a glimpse as to what is going on in that graphic memoir. So, a bit of a dialogue before image one, and I'll quote it from the book. Bechdel asks her mother, "Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. Don't think about it, just say the first thing that comes into your head. What's the main thing you learned from your mother?" And the mom's response is what you see in image one, that boys are more important than girls. So there is this clear kind of generational kind of trauma that the women in the Bechdel family are experiencing. And it is a universal kind of concept because it is the result of patriarchy. And so when Bechdel remarks at the third panel, "But you worship John and Christian, her little brothers," there is this clear kind of resentment kind of underlying the question. Like, if you knew that, boys are more important than girls, why didn't I, Allison, get more attention from you, my mother? There is a lot of familial kind of conflict that is underneath this conversation. Are you my mother? There is a lot more effort and kind of dialogue placed with identifying memoir and kind of what went on kind of in the background in terms of Bechdel's thoughts and experiences as she wrote Fun Home, and including as she wrote Are You My Mother? And so one of those things is the inclusion of the therapist that Bechdel went to. And in image 2, we see Bechdel dealing with aggression, with anger, with these emotions that she has not allowed herself to express ever since she was a child. Her therapist directly confronts her and says, if she basically says, like, you are beautiful, you are nice, you are cute, you are adorable. She uses the specific word adorable. And so Bechdel is doubting, her as a mentor and kind of like as a therapist. She's like, if I really were all those things, I would die. And that is just a very sad kind of perspective to have, but it is very personal, very emotional. And then the therapist replies and kind of shocks Bechdel into saying, because you'd rather die than feel anger at your mother for not giving you what you needed. So definitely not saying that Bechdel's mother was, cruel, but there is that aspect of neglect, that emotional neglect that Bechdel needed and didn't receive at all, left a gap that kind of left her traumatized for years to come. I mean, in her relationship, she talks a lot about how she broke up with some of her partners. And so she would not blame the partner, she would actually blame herself. And so her therapist explains that is, that self-blame is because she couldn't rely on anyone when she was younger. Therefore, all she depends on is herself. She doesn't really have anyone to fall back on. And so those are the two key concepts that Are You My Mother tackles. Bechdel's identity, kind of coming to terms with her relationship with her mother, but at the same time demonstrating that mental illness, that mental trauma that she experienced growing up. One thing that both comics share is the mention of OCD. So I am including a strip of what Are You My Mother shows, but this strip is near identical to the one we see in Fun Home. When she talks about having OCD and the way her mother would help her write the lines when she was sick. So when talking about truth and fidelity in memoirs, the specific common point, this common thread, is something that can be used in order to analyze kind of how is Bechdel tackling the truth. Like, she's not embellishing anything because clearly these are near identical panels. And so that is very important in analyzing memoirs and kind of how loyal, how do they deal with truth. And lastly, like I mentioned before, Bechdel's Are You My Mother has a conversation and has a lot of, it has a lot of sections where it talks about how memoirs work. But this one in particular struck me as important in kind of demonstrating a bit of the thought process that Bechdel undergoes. And so when talking to her mom basically says, hey, I found this quote because I was reading something about memoirs. And so it is a quote by Dorothy Gallagher. And it basically says, the writer's business is to find the shape in unruly life and to serve her story. Not, you may note, to serve her family or to serve the truth, but to serve the story. So this coincides with Coaser's kind of opinions in chapter 4, where it talks about the history of, American memoirs, where there is this fidelity to truth and kind of like preserving the truth as it is and not as how my mother said it or how my father said it. Not to serve the family, but just to serve essentially the truth. And so those key points are basically what my paper will be about. And of course, here are the credits. But in a nutshell, we're exploring how Fun Home and Are You My Mother are blending the genre and kind of producing something unique, something special, in addition to remaining, very focused on truth that, Cousar focuses and mentions. So thank you for watching.